The first thing I noticed about Addie Marsh was not the vitiligo. It was that she had already decided tonight was going to be exactly what she expected, and she had showed up anyway. She sat at a table near the far wall of the wine bar with a glass of red. She wasn't really drinking, her phone in her other hand, and the expression of someone running a very accurate simulation of the next 90 minutes. She had predicted the awkward opener, the over-explained setup, the performance of normalcy from a man who hadn't been told quite enough and was deciding in real time how much it mattered. She had run this version before. The particular set of her shoulders, not defeated, just braced, told me she'd showed up anyway because she was the kind of person who did. That was the first thing I noticed, the brace. And the fact that she'd came, I stood in the doorway for 3 seconds and understood everything. Then I started toward her. My name is Jonah Calloway, 36 years old. I ran an architectural salvage business out of a converted warehouse on the edge of a neighborhood that couldn't decide what it wanted to be yet, the kind of work that required patience with broken things and a specific reluctance to let them stay that way. My last serious girlfriend, Paige, had a sentence for what was wrong with me. She said loving me was like living in a building I designed and restored specifically for her and then couldn't tell her I loved. Every room functional, every joint exact, and somehow impossible to actually feel at home in. She left for a man she described as warmer. For about 4 months after, I reorganized my salvage inventory and called it healing. That morning, the morning I met Addie, I'd been up since 4:30 for demolition pickup 3 counties over. An original set of 1920s hexagonal floor tiles, black and white, the kind they stopped making right and never quite got right again. I was lifting the last flat of them into the van when one slipped and shattered on the concrete floor. Just one out of 48. But I thought about it the whole drive back, not because the tile was expensive, because it was the last of something that shouldn't have to be the last. I was still carrying that particular weight when my best friend Theo called at noon and said, "Just come for drinks tonight." Low key, bring nothing. Low key was how Theo wrapped things I would have refused if I'd seen them clearly first. The wine bar had low lights and the kind of menu that apologized for nothing. Theo and his partner Simone were at the bar doing a focused, unconvincing performance of 2 people studying a cocktail list. I looked at them. I looked at the woman by the far wall. I understood the whole operation in about 8 seconds. She looked up from her phone exactly as I started toward her. Not with surprise, with the patient expression of someone who'd watched the opening credits of this film several times and was waiting to see if this version ended differently. "You must be Jonah," she said. "And you must be the woman who was told tonight would be casual." One corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile yet, the shadow of the consideration of one. "I was told you were reasonably functional." That is a significant overstatement of my case. I'm starting to see that. Her eyes tracked to the bar for half a second. They're watching. I noticed. "You don't look surprised." I look betrayed. I said, "I'm just doing it quietly." Something shifted in her posture half a degree. The difference between a door that's bolted and one that's simply closed. She set her phone face down on the table. "Sit down," she said. Not with warmth, exactly, with honesty. Which was better? I sat. Her name was Addie Marsh. Addie Adelaide, she explained, was reserved for arguments with her grandmother, and she preferred not to begin a first conversation already losing one. She was a pediatric speech-language pathologist at a children's hospital on the north side of the city, where she spent her days helping small people find the specific words for the specific things they needed to say. I found out later that she'd chosen the field because she'd watched a younger brother struggle for 3 years to be heard, and had decided at age 11 that she was going to spend her professional life making sure people got to say the true thing. The kind of person who decides that at 11 and then spends 22 years making it happen is not the kind of person you meet and walk away from without understanding what you walked away from. I understood that about 30 minutes in, but I'm getting ahead of it. Her vitiligo was extensive, the kind that doesn't arrange itself to be convenient. It had moved across her left jaw, curved around one cheekbone, swept down her throat, mapped both hands in 2 tones. A deep, warm brown that was her base, and a pale cream white that had arrived on its own schedule. It moved the way weather moves, following no particular plan. She was 33 and had had it since she was 7, and she introduced it to the conversation herself, plainly, around the time our drinks arrived. Most people spend the first 20 minutes, she said, working very hard to look like they're not looking. I find it easier to name it. Vitiligo. I said, since I was 7. My mother has it too. She calls it the family signature. She's right to. I meant it directly the way you mean something that's simply accurate, not the way you mean something you're performing. Then I reached for the bread basket. Is the bread any good here? She watched me for a moment. That long, careful look I would come to understand was not uncertainty, but assessment. The difference is everything. Then she said, I already took the good roll. That's aggressive for someone I just met. I'm very direct about carbohydrates. Is that in the diagnostic manual? She laughed. A small one, the kind that escaped before she could decide whether she'd meant it. Her hand moving briefly to cover her mouth and then stopping, like she'd caught herself hiding. It was bright and brief, and she reeled it back almost immediately. I felt it somewhere in my chest and made a note to be careful about that feeling. Theo and Simone did not go home. They moved from the bar to a smaller table along the side wall, which was somehow worse, like a documentary crew, reducing their footprint mid-shoot to achieve plausible deniability. I chose not to mention it. So did Addie. Instead, she told me about a patient she called the ambassador. 4 years old, nonverbal for 2.5 years, which in the clinical record meant one thing, and in the room with him meant another. He had been communicating the entire time, pointing, organizing objects, watching the expressions of adults with a scientist's precision, but waiting until he had something specific enough to say to bother finding the words for it. One morning, he produced a complete sentence asking for a different color plate. Not a different plate, the blue one. The specificity, she said, turning her wine glass by the stem. He hadn't been silent. He'd been building vocabulary for the exact thing he needed. A pause. I think about that a lot. People who are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they're waiting for the sentence that's accurate enough. Something in that sentence landed somewhere specific in me, and I didn't examine it because I wasn't ready for what the examination would show. We ordered. She interrogated the server about the pasta with the focused cordiality of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. The server, a young woman with the particular expression of someone who found this genuinely refreshing, answered everything and came back with a small dish of cracked black pepper nobody had asked for, but Addie had clearly wanted. She likes you, I said. Everyone likes me professionally, Addie said, adding the pepper. I'm paid to be the kind of warm that people feel safe in. Is that different from actually warm? She considered. It goes all the way through, she said. But I choose when to open the door. I understood that, not because I was built the same way I wasn't, but because I recognized the architecture. I'd spent 2 years keeping the structural integrity of my own closed door and calling it self-protection. The bread was good. The roll I had was the inferior one. I ate it without commenting. Then my phone lit up on the table. Hey, going okay? She's great, right? Listen, we figured if we told you ahead of time, you might talk yourself out of it. No offense. This is for your own good. I looked at the message. Then I looked at Addie. She had seen it. The screen was angled toward her, not away. Her expression had shifted into something very still. Not surprised, not hurt. The specific stillness of someone who had predicted this exact moment and was watching to see how the next 30 seconds went. I turned the phone face up. I typed, "Go home, Theo. Both of you. Now." Sent it. 3 dots appeared. Then nothing. Addie watched me do it. "What did you say?" I told them to leave. "They won't." "No." I agreed, but now it's on record that I meant it. I put the phone in my coat pocket. If this is a date, they don't get to watch it. If it's not, they definitely don't. She held my eyes for a long moment. The assessing silence, not hesitation, attention. They thought you'd need an adjustment period. I don't. Her look was level and slightly challenging. How do I know that? You don't, I said. Not to perform confidence. Because that was the honest answer. You have 90 minutes of evidence. What I can tell you is that I'm not going to act like the thing about you worth noticing is the thing they were afraid to tell me. That sentence landed. I watched it land. Something at the corner of her eyes went very briefly soft and came back almost immediately. But I saw it, and I stored it the way you store things you need to be careful not to break. That was well said. She told me, "I have 1 good sentence in me per week. I've been saving it," She looked at me for another beat. Then she picked up her wine glass. All right, she said. Then we're on a date. Apparently, in that case, she pushed the breadbasket toward me. Eat something. You've been up since 4:30 and it shows. I took the inferior role. It was unexpectedly fine. For 2 hours, the restaurant narrowed around us until the background noise became irrelevant. She told me the worst date she'd ever been on. A man who spent 90 minutes explaining an article he'd read about melanin and then asked if she ever wished things were different, as though her face were circumstance she'd been waiting to be released from. What did you say? I asked. I said I wished he'd ordered the pork chop instead of the chicken, because at least the chicken had been interesting to talk about. A pause. Then I paid my half and left before dessert. Proportionate. I thought so. She rested her fingers on the stem of her glass. The worst part wasn't the ignorance. It was that he thought he was being considerate. He'd done research. He wanted credit for the preparation. Preparation instead of attention, I said. She looked up. Exactly. Research says, I anticipated you. Attention says, I'm actually here. I thought about Paige then, about building everything perfectly and never being present in what I'd built. About the 4 months of organized inventory that were, in hindsight, just the longest possible way to avoid understanding what I'd lost. Not because Paige had been wrong to leave, because she'd identified the problem correctly and I'd spent 2 years treating the symptom instead of the cause. We split dessert. Addie ate 3/4 of the creme brulee with the systematic focus of someone exercising professional patience in the service of a very personal goal. I watched the operation with something that wasn't yet admiration but was neighboring it. You planned that, I said. I waited for an opening. She set the spoon down. Most things have one. Outside, under the wine bar's narrow awning, November rain misted the street into silver. I offered to walk her to her car. You don't have to, she said. I know. I turned up my collar. Where are you parked? She studied me for a moment. Then she started walking, and I fell into step beside her. Her car was 2 blocks east. We moved slowly, not because either of us had to. The rain did something deliberate with the street lamps, turned every wet surface into something worth looking at. I held the umbrella over her. Not because she'd asked, not because she needed it, because I'd spent enough years working outside in weather to know the difference between inconvenience and discomfort. And I didn't want her to be uncomfortable. She noticed. She didn't comment. She let it be without making it a thing, which was its own kind of answer. At her car, dark green compact with a parking permit from the Children's Hospital still in the windshield, she turned to face me. The street lamp above us caught both tones of her skin simultaneously. The warm brown and the pale patches at her jaw and throat lit the way certain things look when the light is doing its best work. I noticed this the way I noticed the grain in old wood, as information about what I was looking at. Not as an event that required managing. I told Theo I wasn't doing another setup, she said. Another blind date? Another situation where I walked in as the variable. Her voice was even. Where the whole purpose of me being there was to observe someone else's reaction. I said nothing, but this one ended differently. She looked at me, how differently, a long moment. Then text me when you get home. She got in her car and the engine turned and the taillights moved out into the rain. And I stood on the corner for longer than any reasonable account of events would require. Me, 10:47 p.m. and strong showing on all 3 counts. Me, the creme brulee was good, for the record. I know, I had the last bite. I have no comment on the ethics of that. That's growth. 2 minutes of quiet. Then Saturday, farmer's market, Penn Avenue, 9 a.m. Only if you're actually a morning person and not just performing it. He's up at 4:30 today. Perfect. Come alone. Already the plan. I know. That's why I said it. The farmer's market in November is cold in the particular way of a city that takes pride in its winters. Vendors in 3 layers, coffee in paper cups, root vegetables and late persimmons, and the smell of wood smoke from a stall selling ornamental gourds. Addie arrived 6 minutes after me in a coat the color of old brick that had clearly survived several winters and intended to survive several more, carrying a canvas tote and 2 coffees she'd bought from a truck around the corner without asking what I wanted. I looked at the cup she handed me, black with 1 sugar. she said. You look like someone who takes the austere position and then makes exactly one compromise. It was precisely right. That's an invasive amount of pattern recognition. It's my job. She sipped her own oat milk, something warm spiced. You'll either get used to it or find it irritating. Either answer tells me something useful. We moved through the market with opinions. She bartered for persimmons with a cheerfulness that was also, I noticed, completely serious. She knew what fair price was, and she was willing to be friendly and relentless in pursuit of it simultaneously. I spent 11 minutes talking to a vendor about reclaimed barn siding, Douglas fir, a century-old, structurally perfect, while she waited without checking her phone, without the performance of patience people do when someone else's enthusiasm runs long. She just waited. When I came back, she said, "Your hands moved when you talked about it." That's a tell. I have tells. Everyone does. Most people are embarrassed by them. She adjusted her scarf. I like them. There were the performance drops. What's yours? She thought about it. I ask more questions when I'm nervous. How many questions have you asked this morning? A pause. 5. So, she agreed without apology. At a truck near the end of the row, she bought second coffees before I could reach my wallet. I started to protest, and she gave me a look that settled the debate. Not because she needed to win, because she'd already decided the outcome, and arguing would have been performing something I wasn't actually feeling. Most men argue about this, she said, handing me the cup. About coffee? About the principle of coffee, the reciprocity mathematics. She stirred, like if a woman buys a second cup, something has gone wrong in the natural order. That does seem like a lot of energy for a Tuesday. It is. And yet, she started walking. You didn't. Should I have? No. She glanced at me sideways. I just noticed that you didn't. And I'm telling you, I noticed, because I pay attention to the things that are different from what I expected. I turned that over. The sensation of someone tracking the specific things about me rather than the general shape of me. It was unfamiliar in a way that felt unexpectedly like relief. A child appeared at the edge of Addie's coat, maybe 4 years old, hat with fox ears, staring up at her with the complete focus of a small person who had not yet been taught to pretend they didn't see visible things. The child stared at Addie's hands, her face. Then, with the directness of someone for whom curiosity was still just curiosity, "How come you're 2 colors?" Addie crouched immediately, completely. "I just am," she said. "Some people are 1 color, some people are 2. The child processed this. "My dog is Spots. What's his name?" "Walnut," said with absolute authority, like any other name would have been obviously wrong. "Walnut is an excellent name," Addie said, entirely seriously. "Does Walnut know it's an excellent name?" "Yes. He's very smart. He can open the pantry. That deserves significant respect." The mother had appeared behind her child, bracing for the apology sequence parents have to run when their children notice visible things out loud. Addie glanced up at her and shook her head barely, just once. "Not right now." The mother stopped. She was smart enough to take the direction. When they'd gone, I crouched beside Addie as she stood. "You're good at that. At talking to 4-year-olds, at not making people feel ashamed of being curious." She straightened her coat. "Shame is a very bad teacher. I'm professionally a teacher." A pause. "Besides, Walnut can open the pantry." That deserved acknowledgement. I laughed, not politely. The real kind. The kind that surprised me slightly. She caught it. "That one started somewhere in your chest and arrived late to your face," she said. "Those were the good ones." I looked at her. Something in the way she said it, the specific observation, the easy certainty did more to my chest than I was prepared for. I didn't say that. Not because I couldn't, because the accurate sentence hadn't arrived yet, and I had spent 2 years learning what happened when you said the approximate one too soon. The third date was the warehouse. She'd asked to see it on the second date, casually, with the quotation marks audible. I said yes before. I understood why I was nervous about it. The apartment was where I slept. The warehouse was the place I actually lived, the place where you could see what I actually was by what I'd chosen to keep. Showing someone that is different from any restaurant, She walked through it slowly, hands behind her back, like someone in a gallery who knows how to look properly. The shelves of salvaged hardware, the leaded glass windows propped against the walls, original crown molding in sorted sections, a cast iron radiator pulled from a condemned building on the east side, a set of Victorian-era transom windows. I'd been waiting on the right buyer for. She stopped at the mahogany pocket doors near the back wall, stood in front of them for a long moment. "These are waiting for something," she said. "Not everything sells when it should." She ran her finger along the grain. "What makes these worth keeping? The depth of the color. The hardware is original, hinges, track, everything intact. These were built into a house in 1897 by someone who wasn't building for 20 years. I stopped. You don't put something like that in a dumpster because nobody arrived at the right moment with the right offer. A quiet fell between us, the kind that had weight in it, the kind that lands when two people are in the same silence and both of them know they're not entirely talking about doors. She turned to look at me, not quickly. Her name was Paige, I said. Addie went still, not stiff, the stillness of someone who has decided to listen with everything they have. 4 years, I said. She was patient with me, which she eventually told me had been exhausting. She said, I showed love like a building shows love. You're inside it. It was designed specifically for you. It functions perfectly, and you have no idea whether it wants you there. I looked at the doors. She wasn't wrong. She left for someone warmer. I reorganized my inventory for 4 months and called it recovery. Addie waited. The problem wasn't that I couldn't feel things, I said. I felt everything. The problem was I'd learned to express all of it through action. Fix things, build things, restore things. Somewhere in all that usefulness, I forgot that being present is different from being dependable, and that the difference is everything. How long did it take you to understand that? About 6 months. Something almost smiled and didn't quite arrive. I bought takeout for 2 for 6 weeks after she left, out of habit. Every few days I'd come home with enough for 2 people and sit with the extra container and not know what to do with it. I paused. I mentioned at the farmer's market that I do it sometimes. I remember I'd been doing it again, I said, for a few weeks. Before I understood what that meant, the warehouse was warm and quiet, rain on the skylights, the low, steady percussion of it. Addie's hand rested near the edge of one of the pocket doors, not gripping it, just near. His name was Dominic, she said. I waited. He loved how I looked. She said it the way you'd state a weather fact accurate, without particular warmth. He used the word unique. He introduced me at parties by walking me in and letting the room react before he said anything else. He wasn't cruel. He was proud. She paused, which is its own category of problem. Not because the pride was wrong, because being prized and being known are not the same thing, and she'd spent 2 years inside the distance between them. 2 years, she continued. Quote, it took me a long time to see it. To understand that the way he loved me required me to be seen, not heard. Every conversation eventually circled back to how I appeared in it. Her thumb moved once across the wood. When I finally left, he was genuinely surprised. He thought I was happy. Were you? I was being held, she said. And I mistook that for being known for longer than I should have. The specific weight of that sentence settled between us. The thing I'm afraid of, she said, her voice level, but something careful behind it, something she decided to offer instead of protect as being someone's proof, someone's story about how good they are, how open-minded. She set her hand down on her side. I've been that story. Not for cruel men, for men who needed me to be a certain kind of answer to a question they were asking about themselves. I don't have that question, I said. She held my eyes. I want to know if you like mornings, I said. What you order when no one's watching, whether you finish the book when it's not working or whether you put it down. Something in her face shifted. A door, the difference between closed and opening. I hate mornings, she said. I order the same thing at restaurants I like because why risk it? And I put the book down. A pause. I used to finish them. I stopped when I understood I was doing it for completion, not for the book. What changed? I got better at knowing when something wasn't going anywhere. Honest. She held my eyes. I've gotten very specific about what I'm willing to spend time on. The rain on the skylight continued its low percussion. I took a step closer. Not dramatically, just closing the distance between a question and what it deserved. Can I? Yes, she said, before I finished. Not because she'd stopped being careful, because she'd been careful enough for long enough to understand the difference between caution and avoidance, and she'd decided I was worth the difference. I kissed her in front of the mahogany pocket doors in the warm light of the warehouse. She was warmer than I'd expected. Her hand came to my chest and rested there without asking anything. When we broke apart, she kept her hand where it was. I'm not him, I said. I know. She looked at the placement of her own hand. That's why I said yes before you finished asking. 6 weeks after we met, I found a intact matching tile at a demolition site 2 counties over. Hexagonal, black and white, original 1920s glaze, and whole, the last of a set that had otherwise not survived. I drove 28 minutes out of my way to get it. I didn't think about why until I was in the truck heading back and the tile was wrapped in moving blankets on the passenger seat, and I understood with the clarity of a thing that has been obvious for a while that I'd been driving toward her for 6 weeks and calling it something more modest. I brought it to her that evening. She unwrapped it on her kitchen counter and held it in both hands, the pale skin of her palms against the black and white glaze. She looked at it for a long time. You drove out of your way, she said. The restoration project I was on needed matching material. Did it? A pause. No. She set the tile carefully down on the counter. Then she looked at me with the particular expression of someone choosing the gentler of 2 true things. Thank you, she said. She put it on the windowsill of her study that afternoon. She didn't mention it again. It was simply there, the way things are when they belong somewhere. Theo and Simone came for dinner a month after the wine bar. Addie chose the restaurant, accessible entrance, good sight lines. Lighting she checked in advance. She ordered a bottle of wine before they arrived and poured 4 glasses with the precise hospitality of someone who controlled the room by being its most welcoming occupant. They arrived carrying the specific energy of people who knew they owed a debt and were uncertain of the denominations. The apology came before the appetizers. Theo said it directly. Simone said it carefully. Addie listened without performing graciousness. When they finished, she said, I want to understand the specific decision you made, not the intention, the decision. Theo swallowed. We thought we were afraid if we told Jonah everything up front, he might say no before he had a chance to know you. So you put the risk of his reaction on me, Addie said, not raising her voice. You made me the test. If he behaved well, the experiment succeeded. If he didn't, I was the one in the room when it failed. The table was quiet. When you say it like that, Simone said softly. That's the only way it is, Addie said. Precisely. Not cruelly. I've been the variable before. I'd prefer not to be the variable anymore. She picked up her wine. This dinner's going to be very good, and by the end of it, you're going to feel like you've made amends, and I'm going to let you, because effort matters even when execution is imperfect. But I needed to say the specific thing first. Theo looked at me. She's right, I said. I know, he said. By dessert, something had loosened, not resolved, loosened. The way a knot does when you stop pulling and start understanding which end to move. Under the table, Addie's knee pressed against mine. I put my hand on her knee, and she covered it with hers without looking away from the conversation. Not because she needed to announce anything, because she wanted to. In December, Dominic called. She told me that evening, sitting cross-legged on my couch with a cup of tea she was letting go cold, which meant she was processing something significant. He heard through someone that I was seeing someone, she said. He wants to talk. Closure, apparently. Do you want to? No. Immediate. Then softer. But part of me wants him to see that I'm not. She stopped. Not where he left you. She looked at me. Is that petty? It's human. I chose my next words carefully. There's a difference between doing something for someone else's benefit and closing a door that someone else left open. The second one is for you. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you'd come? Not into the room, I said. 300 feet away with bad coffee and a clear sight line. Not as a shield. Because being nearby is the most honest thing I know how to offer. She put her tea down and reached across the couch and placed her hand on the side of my face. Not a question. An arrival. Jonah, she said. I've been carrying something around for 3 weeks and I keep not saying it. The room went very still. The particular stillness of something that has been in the air long enough to become heavy. I keep making your coffee by heart, she said. Black, 1 sugar. I've been doing it since the 2nd week. My hand just knows. She paused. I made it this morning. In my own kitchen. You weren't there. I held completely still. I made the right amount for 2, she said. And then I stood there for a minute and understood what that meant. And then I didn't tell you for 3 weeks because she stopped. Started again. Because naming it out loud felt like risking it. That landed somewhere specific and stayed. What does it mean? I asked. I already knew. I needed to hear her say the accurate thing. It means I love you, Addie said. It means I stopped being afraid of that at some point and didn't make a formal announcement. Her eyes held mine, direct and unguarded in a way she'd been working up to for 3 weeks. It means the extra cup made complete sense, and that's new. The room was warm and quiet, and everything in me that had been holding itself in careful readiness for whatever came next stopped needing to hold. I love you, I said. I've been carrying that since the warehouse. I paused. Since the farmer's market, honestly. Since you handed me the coffee without asking. Since I bought the coffee. I almost said it in the parking lot after that 2nd Saturday. Why didn't you too soon? I said. I thought you'd think I was performing. She looked at me for a moment. Then she started laughing, the real one. The one that started in her chest and arrived late to her face, unguarded and completely specific. I would not have thought that, she said. No? No. She pulled me toward her. I would have thought, finally. I kissed her in the warm quiet of my apartment while December rain ticked against the window, and she kissed me back with the full weight of someone who has made a decision she is certain of and is done pretending she hasn't. When we stopped, her forehead rested against mine. Stop waiting for it to go wrong, she said, softly, accurately. Old habit, new life. She kissed me again. I kissed her back. The silence after the complete kind, no edges, the kind that sounds like everything being in the right place at the same time was the best silence I had ever been in. 3 weeks later, she left a second coffee on my kitchen counter on a morning she'd stayed over. She left before I was awake. I found it at 6:15, still warm, with a note that said, I made it right. I know you know I made it right. I stood at my counter in the thin winter morning and understood for the first time in 2 years what it felt like to be known. Not as a type, not as a project, not as something being prized or tested or handled, just known. Dominic had chosen a coffee place near his office. He was outside when we arrived. Expensive coat, the posture of someone who had rehearsed what he wanted to look like. He saw her first, then me, then our joined hands. Addie didn't change her grip. Neither did I. Inside, she chose a window table. I found a seat across the room with genuinely terrible coffee and a clear view of her left profile, close enough to see, far enough that this was entirely hers. Not because she couldn't handle it, because standing 300 feet away was the truest version of what I'd offered, and I was going to honor it exactly. They talked for 26 minutes. I watched a pigeon conduct elaborate negotiations with a pretzel on the window ledge outside and tried not to read meaning into the outcome. When she came out, she walked toward me with the specific lightness of someone who has set something down somewhere permanent. How was it? I asked. He said I stayed with him. She got in the car. I said I was glad I'd stayed with myself. And then I finished my coffee. That's the right sentence. I thought so. She buckled her seatbelt. He asked if we could stay in touch. I said I didn't think so. He asked why. I said because friendship requires the same honesty that love does, and I didn't think we'd manage that the first time. She looked out the window. He looked surprised. He shouldn't have been. No. A quiet beat. Drive somewhere with a view. I drove us to the overlook on the south side where the city fills the valley below at night like a circuit board someone left lit. We sat with the engine off and sandwiches I'd brought from the deli near the warehouse, and she put her feet on the dashboard, and we talked about nothing that mattered for an hour, which was its own kind of everything. After a while, she said, "You brought sandwiches. I figured you wouldn't want a restaurant." You figured right. She held up the second half of hers. You also remembered the mustard. I pay attention. She looked at me over the sandwich. I know, she said. That's the whole thing, Jonah. That's actually the whole thing. I took her hand. She was already reaching for mine. 7 months later, we moved into the top floor of a converted building in a neighborhood that was halfway between its history and whatever it was going to be next, which felt appropriate. Wide plank floors, original transom windows, a kitchen that forgave imprecision. Her 4 plants became 11. I built her a potting shelf beside the window, and she said it made her feel too settled, and then used it every single day without further commentary on the paradox. The mahogany pocket doors, the ones from the warehouse, the ones that had been waiting, went between the living room and the study, her research files, my architectural drawings, 12 years of notes on historic building materials I'd been adding to since the beginning. She ran her hand over the wood the first time we closed them. "These are the ones," she said. "Yes, you kept them all this time. Some things wait for where they belong." Not because I was certain I looked at them, because I wasn't willing to put them somewhere wrong. She pulled me through the pocket doors and kissed me in the afternoon light without saying anything further, which was the right response. The hexagonal tile sat on the windowsill of the study. The 1920s one, the one I'd driven 28 minutes to retrieve 6 weeks after we met, the one she'd placed on the sill that afternoon, and neither of us had moved since. It was still there. Neither of us mentioned it. Neither of us needed to. Theo came over the first weekend with a bottle of wine and the expression of a man who had gotten something right by accident and was trying very hard to be humble about it. He was mostly succeeding. "You're happy," he said. "Yes." He nodded, drank his wine. "Paige was wrong about you," he said eventually. I looked at him. "She said you were absent. You weren't absent. You just needed someone who made being present feel worth the risk." He turned his glass. "Or someone who is specific enough that approximating your feelings stopped being possible." I thought about the extra coffee, about Addie saying the true thing first in every significant moment and then waiting to see what I did with it. About how being with her hadn't changed what I was. It had made what I was finally worth saying out loud. "She didn't make it safe," I said. "She made it worth the risk." Theo looked at me. "That's better," he said. "That's actually better." 1 year after the wine bar, same month, same November, rain, I took Addie back there. She raised an eyebrow when she recognized it. "Intentional?" "Entirely." "Is anyone watching from the bar?" "Expressly forbidden, with consequences communicated clearly in advance." She sat down with the ease of someone who had no performance left in her for this particular room, no test to anticipate, no simulation to run, the same low light, the same expensive bread. She was wearing the copper earrings from Montreal, which I'd noticed the moment she walked in and said nothing about for 22 minutes, purely out of stubbornness. She caught me looking. "You noticed immediately. Obviously, you said nothing." I was exercising restraint. "You were creating drama." "Those are different skills that happen to be adjacent." She pointed at me. "That's going on a tile somewhere. I have inventory." She smiled, not careful, not assessing, not braced, just hers. Entirely. Given without calculation. I had been on the receiving end of it for a year, and it still did the same specific thing to my chest every time. We ordered. She interrogated the server about the Bordeaux with the focused cordiality that had apparently charmed every server in every restaurant I'd ever taken her to. The candle between us threw the same imprecise gold as the task lamps in the warehouse. "You're staring," she said. "At the woman I love. Still acceptable?" She reached across the table and I took her hand. The pale skin of her fingers and the darker skin of her wrist and the small scar on her left knuckle that she'd told me about once, and I'd remembered not because I was cataloging her, but because every true thing about her had been worth keeping. "A year ago," I said, "I walked into this bar expecting to go home by 9:30 and eat whatever was in the refrigerator standing over the sink. A year ago," she said, "I walked in here expecting to run a simulation for 90 minutes, grade it charitably, and then call my mother to discuss the good intentions of people who don't understand that good intentions aren't the same as good decisions. What did you tell her instead?" She looked at our joined hands, then at me. I told her someone had said the accurate thing and then moved on to the next topic like that was normal. A pause. She said, "Adelaide, if you're deciding between afraid and relieved, choose relieved." Smart woman. She is. Her thumb moved across my knuckles. She was right. Outside, under the awning, the November rain had come back. Same month, same silver mist, the city doing something deliberate with the light. I kissed her with the specific confidence of a man who has stopped rehearsing and started showing up. She kissed me back with the full weight of someone who has made peace with how good things can be when you stop bracing for them to end. When we got home, she reached the building first and held the door. "Coming?" she said. She was lit from behind by the hallway light, coat damp at the shoulders, copper earrings catching it, looking at me with the expression I'd come to understand as entirely particular to me, the one that meant she'd opened the door and was choosing to stay near it. I stepped inside. Here's what this year taught me. I spent 2 years after Paige being structurally sound and emotionally absent and calling the combination self-protection. I was very good at showing up, very good at being useful, very good at every version of care that could be performed through action and never required me to say the thing out loud. Addie did not cure this. She is not a cure, and she would object to the framing. What she did was be so specific about what she needed, about what she'd learned, about the difference between being prized and being known, that staying in the general version of myself stopped being possible. I used to think being dependable was the whole job. It isn't. Being dependable means you show up. Being present means you're actually there when you do. She needed both at once. I didn't know I could do both until I had a reason. The safest thing I ever did was stop performing safety and try being real. Last Sunday morning, I came downstairs to find 2 coffees on the counter and Addie already reading at the kitchen table in her pajamas, a plant that needed repotting sitting on the chair beside her like a small green appointment she hadn't gotten to yet. She looked up when I came in. She handed me the coffee she'd already made. She didn't ask how I slept. She didn't comment on the hour. She went back to reading. I sat down. The rain that had been threatening since the night before was finally happening outside the window, gentle and silver and doing something deliberate with the morning light. That was it. That was the whole thing. And I want to ask you something. If you had walked into that room not knowing what was waiting for you, not knowing what the setup was or what it was going to cost the other person, what would you have done? Would you have found the polite exit, stayed out of obligation, looked for the first graceful way out? Or would you have done what she did? Showed up, already braced, said the true thing first, and waited to see if the person across from you was brave enough to meet it? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story felt like something you needed today, share it with someone who might need it too. You probably already know exactly who. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because next time, we're talking about what happens when you finally stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself first and what you find when you get there.